I think that Jesuit spirituality has this, what do I want to say, sort of this worldly cast to it. Or it has a very reconciliatory cast to it. Well, not that every Jesuit writer and every Jesuit is, goes this way, but I think this is pervasive. And where does it come from? And how different it is, say, from the Jansenists. I mean, the Jansenists, let's say they're Augustinian, right? I mean, that's the person that they claim as their origin, and the great doctor of grace and so forth, so like in line with Luther and Calvin. And it's sort of grace alone. There's like this kind of prophetic anti-world cast to it. Sort of suspicious of secular culture. Not want to be contaminated by the world. Of course, there's some of that in Jesuit spirituality too. It's in every Christian spirituality. But why did the Jesuits, by and large, develop differently? For one thing, there was experience at Paris of the first companions and their exposure there to Thomism. And then when they came to Rome in the 1530s and 40s, Thomism was alive and well and very much promoted in the papal court. There was a great celebration in Rome every year for the Feast of Thomas Aquinas, unlike any other celebration outside of the papal court itself. It was in the Dominican Church of the Minerva. And what Thomas, I mean, it's nature, grace, perfecting nature. Aquinas using Aristotle as a framework for approaching theology. So again, whatever you certainly, especially with Thomas, there's this kind of reconciliatory dynamic there. Then through the influence of Polanco, but maybe for Ignatius himself also, in the constitutions, this insistence that it's important to use the human means to attain our end. They're not on the same level as the more spiritual means, but these are good and they're to be used. And in training preachers, to use the pagan orators like Cicero, Demosthenes, that rhetoric is okay for Christian use. And you can see even in the spiritual exercises itself, although it's a plastic text, it's a classic, can be looked at in different ways. The contemplation for obtaining love. God's operating out there in all kinds of mysterious ways, but always operating out there in the world in different ways. Constitution's finding God in all things, searching for God in all things. So there's this foundation there from the very beginning. And then, bing, you get to schools. And what are you doing in most of those schools? You're teaching boys who are going to be living in the world. You want to make them practical in the world. You're looking to the civic good here in this world. You're looking to their eternal salvation, of course, to their spiritual growth, but not just that. Those 15 reasons that Polanco gives for why the society is engaging in formal schooling are extremely interesting. The first 4 or 5 are the advantages to the society. So it helps the society of Jesus. So they were not all that self-effacing. They wanted to make sure that this was help the society itself. Then there were the advantages for the locality, and so that the schools would be a place where parents could have their sons educated without financial burden. It was a place where the Jesuits could, in using the school as a base, be instrumental for the founding of orphanages and hospitals and refuges for reformed prostitutes and so forth. And then finally, it's a but you might say the ultimate reason was these people who were now just students would grow up to be pastors, administrators of justice, and assume other important positions to everybody's advantage and profit. Pretty this worldly, motivated by spiritual concerns. But we're looking for the common good here and now, always with a view to the future, to union with God at the end. One interesting aspect of the Jesuit tradition all the way through, but especially in the first couple centuries, is their commitment to, let's call it the sciences, what would develop into science. This is, where did this come from? It did not come from the humanistic tradition, which was a literary tradition, but it came from the scholastic tradition. That is to say, the tradition of the universities, the tradition that was incorporating Aristotle into its curriculum. And in the so-called arts faculty or philosophical faculty, at Paris, that was the lower faculty. It's kind of propedeutic to the professions of art, medicine, law, and theology. That was predominantly a Greek philosophy. But what do they mean by philosophy? Metaphysics was taught, logic was taught, but most of the emphasis was on natural philosophy, which comes close to the sciences. That is to say, Aristotle on animals, Aristotle on the stars, Aristotle on the physical world in general, Aristotle's physics. And in Italy, that emphasis was even stronger than it was in Northern Europe and, say, at the University of Paris. So the Italian universities were they were much more secular, you might say, than the Northern universities. They were interested in law and especially medicine and in the physical world. Natural philosophy was where so much of the emphasis was. So the Jesuits were trained in the humanities, and then they were also trained in Scholasticism, and this, to a large extent, was natural philosophy. And in the schools, the better schools, even the ones that weren't universities, often would have the students would move into the higher discipline of philosophy, which by and large meant science, what we would call science. So this explains to some extent why the Jesuits got so involved in the sciences and especially in astronomy. So they were, and it was connected with their great interest in mathematics, because these were all sort of interrelated, right? And with Clavius there at the Collegio Romano in the third generation, who gave the society really its impetus towards a strong emphasis on mathematics, especially in Italy, but elsewhere. This helps explain how Matteo Ricci and that crowd, when they went to China, why they had such a repertoire of scientific knowledge, and especially astronomical knowledge, which has to do with constructing an accurate calendar and things like this. So that's one aspect of the Jesuits and the sciences. Another aspect is that Ignatius himself, with the missionaries in very early days, this is a very interesting letter of his when he writes to them and says, now, oh boy, send back to us information. People here want to know about how long the days are, how long the nights are, what kind of plants there are, what kind of animals. We want all this kind of, sort of scientific information. Now, his purpose was largely propagandistic. He wanted to have these letters. They could show them around to people and say, "Oh, that's what the Jesuits are doing. That's what's going on over there," and this win favor and support for the society in its endeavors, including its missionary endeavors. These also fits with him, doesn't it? I mean, it fits with his evolution from a world-hating ascetic in the early days at Manresa to someone who ends up at the most prestigious academic institution of today, the University of Paris, this kind of reconciliation with the world. So he has this interest in the physical world for different reasons, for several reasons. So that's another aspect to it. The Jesuits, in one unexplored aspect of the Jesuit enterprise, is their pharmacies. These were well-known, much respected, and they were especially noted for the fact that they had remedies that were sent from exotic places by the missionaries that the Europeans didn't have, especially quinine, right? Jesuit bark, quinine for malaria. That's one just little piece of their pharmacies. The first pharmacy was set up in Rome by Ignatius himself, in the so-called Red Tower in Rome. It was a very modest affair, and it was especially for the use of Jesuits and clergy, but also for the use of the population. So it's a very interesting enterprise. The Jesuits were, in France in the 17th century, were sent on an astronomical expedition to Siam, Thailand, by the French Royal Academy. Go figure. Highly respected. Important aspect of the Jesuit commitment to sciences and the arts, to the culture of this world. I'm not sure exactly why Ignatius had this pharmacy set up right away, except that he had a person in Rome who was, there were several medical doctors who joined the society at the early, in those very early days. And so he had somebody who could do this. I think this was at least one reason why this pharmacy was set up. And also it was, he was very concerned, as we know from the constitutions, with the physical health of faculty and students. And he prescribed for the Roman college that they have a physician on contract for faculty and students. So he had this concern with physical health. Another extremely interesting aspect of it, we kind of take this for granted today, but this is not typical of Catholic spirituality in the 16th century. Charles Borromeo, a younger contemporary of Ignatius, I mean, he was so terribly hard on his body and neglected his body. This is part of his spiritual regimen, kind of a polar opposite of Ignatius in this regard. There's this kind of corporal, fleshy, if you will, incarnational aspect to Ignatius's vision and the spirituality of the society, which I think is extremely important. It's kind of obvious, but sometimes it needs to be said. And if you look at, Jesuit art patronized by the Jesuits and painted by the Jesuits. Art historians used to say there was talk about a Jesuit style. Well, now we know there was no Jesuit style in the sense of adopting like the Baroque style as their own. A lot of the Jesuit painting is in the Baroque style, so because that was the fashion of the day, but they also built in Gothic style, and in the missions they adapted to the styles of the locality as best they could. But predominantly it was the Baroque style, and the great Jesuit painters, a number of them, but the most renowned of them, Andrea Pozzo, in the late 17th century, frescoed the ceiling of the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome it's a Baroque style. A Baroque style is it's visions of heaven, basically. Very few visions of hell. Visions of heaven, heavenly glory, looking up to the saints and looking up to fleshy saints and fleshy little cherubs floating around. It's interesting.